History often remembers the lightning strike, but forgets the storm that gathered before it.
The phrase, "No Alexander if not for Philip," holds a weight far heavier than simple biology. It is triumphant march, Green.
Before the empire could rise, the dangers had to fall. Philip silenced the threats posed by the meddling Greek states and the encroaching neighboring barbarians.
Crucially, he forged the instrument of empire, an army ready to strike at a moment's notice, and an officer corps defined by capability and loyalty.
Yet, to credit Philip with creating Macedonia from the void is to ignore 3 centuries of resilience. Despite what ancient authors and scholars suggest, Macedonia did not spring from nothing.
Given stable internal affairs and favorable external circumstances, this kingdom represented a power. It all started from small beginnings around the middle of the 7th century, a time when the world looked vastly different. In those days, the Thermaic Gulf extended far west inland, shaping a geography.
Their origin point was south of this extended gulf, a strategic foothold that would serve as the launchpad for their future dominance.
There, on both sides of the Haliacmon River, lay the region called Macedonis, the cradle of the nation. This region, Macedonis, was not just territory, it was the identity of a people.
Within this region lay Ege, the original Macedonian capital, a city of kings long before Pella rose to glory. It was from this mountain stronghold that the Macedonians launched their first expansion, conquering Pieria, the coastal plain to the east.
They pushed all the way to the Olympus, establishing dominance under the shadow of the home of the gods. Their hunger for land drove them further, into Bottiaea, the region extending west and north of the Thermaic Gulf.
This expansion reached up to the Axius River, a natural barrier that they would soon turn into a border, and then a bridge. In this newly acquired territory lay the site of the future capital, Pella, though at this time it was but a promise waiting to be fulfilled. They did not stop at the banks. They crossed the Axius and occupied the fertile plain between this river and the location of present-day Thessaloniki. Thus, they established control over the whole area around the Gulf, turning the coastline into a Macedonian lake. Finally, just before the end of the 6th century, their gaze turned inland, taking over the regions of Iordaea and Almopia. These regions bordered the central plain on the western and northwestern sides, securing the heartland from highland raids.
The capture of Iordaea was pivotal. It lay beyond the mountain ridge, sealing off the plain.
This conquest allowed the Macedonian kings to reach further into Upper Macedonia, a world apart from the coastal lowlands. Here lay the regions of Lyncus, Orestis, and Elymaea, enclosed by mountains and defined by their isolation.
These lands had their own rulers, fierce chieftains whose adherence to the Macedonian kingdom was never guaranteed.
Their loyalty was dependent entirely on the strength of the central rule at any one time. Weakness in Pella meant rebellion in the mountains.
It is impossible now to ascertain exactly when the Macedonian kings first approached these mountain areas.
While the west was a constant struggle, the further expansion toward the east falls into the period after the failure of Xerxes' campaign. The early days of Macedonian history remain obscure, hidden behind a veil of myth and lack of written record. The first certain reports relate to the time of Persian rule on European soil, a time when the east came crashing into the west.
Around 510 BC, the Persian general Megabazus conquered the area along the northern coast of the Aegean.
He accepted the surrender of the Macedonian king Amyntas I, who bowed to the inevitable power of the great king.
During the Ionian Revolt, the Macedonians too shook off Persian sovereignty, seizing a brief moment of freedom. But the empire was not so easily denied. Persian control was restored as early as 492 BC.
Amyntas' son, Alexander I, therefore participated in Xerxes' campaign, not as a king.
Immediately after the Persian defeat at Plataea, the balance of the world shifted.
and Alexander seized his chance.
Alexander defected and took possession of the regions of Anthemus, Mygdonia, Crestonia, and Bisaltia.
These rich lands lay between the Axius and Strymon rivers, vastly increasing the kingdom's resources.
However, in the final years of his reign, he sustained losses on the western banks of the Strymon, a reminder of the fluidity of borders.
His successor, Perdiccas II, who ruled until 413, inherited a kingdom under seal from all sides.
He was not only unable to reverse the losses in the east, but also had to contend with internal fragmentation.
He faced the endeavors of the rulers of Upper Macedonia to establish independence, testing the central authority.
Moreover, in his time, Macedonia was impeded by the suffocating grip of the Athenian naval empire.
The kingdom was inevitably drawn into the conflicts of the Peloponnesian War, a pawn between giants.
But Perdiccas was a survivor. He was able to maneuver a way through the warring factions fairly successfully. For the most part, he managed to maintain the independence of his kingdom against overwhelming odds.
His son Archelaus was destined for a happier rule, inheriting the resilience of his father, but with better fortunes.
Athenian pressure had eased after the Sicilian disaster, giving Macedonia room to breathe. Relations with the Athenians were virtually reversed. Once the masters, they now came as petitioners, relying heavily on Macedonia.
But Archelaus's real contributions lay not in trade, but in domestic politics, his cultural efforts.
He accelerated the extension of the road network, binding the fractured landscape of mountains and plains into a governable whole. Crucially, he initiated the development of a heavily armed infantry, a force that had been glaringly absent in previous conflicts. As shown by the events of the Peloponnesian War, this heavy infantry was the missing piece needed to transform Macedonia from a spectator to a contender.
In the final years of his rule, Archelaus was strong enough to look south, intervening in Thessaly in
His intervention allowed him to gain territory and secure his influence in Larissa, extending the Macedonian shadow deeper into the Greek world.
The right conditions for further extending Macedonian control were therefore in place, a springboard for empire that seemed ready for use. But history is rarely a straight line. In 399, Archelaus was murdered, and the momentum came to a crashing halt. As the saying goes, Macedonian kings tended to die with their boots on, and the stability Archelaus built died with him. During this time, the position that Macedonia had gained under Archelaus could not be retained. The kingdom began to shrink.
The Macedonians saw no fewer than 4 rulers within just 6 years, phantom kings of whom we know little. We can picture Macedonia's troubles more clearly in the first years of the rule of Amyntas III, who ascended the throne in 393.
Soon after taking the crown, Amyntas came under threat from the Illyrians, the perennial nightmare from the northwest.
Desperate, he entered into a defensive alliance with the Chalcidian League, which had become an important power on the north coast. He paid for this safety by ceding the Anthemus, the fertile valley southeast of present-day Thessaloniki.
This alliance, however, did not save him. He was temporarily expelled from his country, a king without a kingdom.
Only in the second half of the 380s was Amyntas secure enough to reclaim his throne and demand back the land he had ceded. Not only did the Chalcidians refuse to return it, but they intervened in Macedonian affairs, threatening to swallow the kingdom whole. Forced into a corner, Amyntas turned to the Spartans, the dominant military power of Greece, who sent an army north in 382.
The Olynthian War began, and according to Xenophon's report, it was fought mainly by the Spartans and their allies.
The Macedonians did not contribute any military force worth mentioning, appearing as junior partners in their own defense. However, Derdus, ruler of the Elymaea, and his cavalry provided useful support, though he fought as an independent ally, not a subject. Perdiccas and his territory are portrayed as being independent of the Macedonian king, showing that the upper kingdoms had broken away.
In 379, the Chalcidian League was dissolved, and the immediate threat was removed.
Amyntas regained the Anthemus, but according to Xenophon, the Spartans did little otherwise to strengthen his rule.
Yet, Isocrates, a slightly older contemporary of Xenophon, took quite a different view of Amyntas' standing. In his Panegyricus, published in 380, he castigates Spartan politics, using Amyntas.
He claims the Spartans helped extend the rule of the Macedonian king Amyntas, the Sicilian tyrant Dionysius, and the great king of Persia.
If Isocrates wished to remain credible, he could not have included a completely insignificant Macedonian king in this trio of world powers.
Therefore, in 380, Amyntas must have been a political power not to be despised, despite his domestic troubles. Isocrates also had something to say about this in his Archidamus, published in the 360s, looking back on Amyntas's life.
Here, Amyntas serves as a perfect example of what can be achieved by sheer determination against impossible odds.
After being vanquished and robbed of all Macedonia, he regained his whole realm within 3 months.
He ruled without interruption into a ripe old age, a feat of survival that few Macedonian kings could claim.
Isocrates could make such an assertion only if Amyntas was recognized as a ruler to be reckoned with, even after his death.
This resilience, this refusal to die, was the true inheritance he passed down to his youngest son, Philip.
Yet, despite Amyntas's survival, the kingdom he left was still fragile, held together by the
Stability was an illusion, a pause in the storm rather than the end of it. The stage was set for the next act, but it would require a new kind of architect to build a permanent structure.
Philip did not just inherit a kingdom, he inherited a history of survival and the lessons of a century of near extinction.
The neighbors were still there, watching, waiting for the moment of weakness that always followed a king's death. And within, the highlands of Upper Macedonia still dreamed of independence, a fractured spine in the body of the kingdom. To survive, the old ways would not suffice. The cycle of rise and fall had to be broken.
Philip had learned from the best, having spent time as a hostage in Thebes, observing the military genius of Epaminondas. He saw that defense was a trap. The only security lay in expansion, in pushing the borders until the threats were swallowed.
The raw material was there, the hardy men of the mountains and plains, but they needed a mold.
The prelude was over. The history of survival was about to become the history of conquest.
Socrates' testimony in the Archidamus is not merely rhetorical. It is a contemporary validation of Macedonian resilience that history often overlooks. By grouping Amyntas with the great king of Persia and the tyrant of Syracuse, Socrates defined the geopolitical triangle of his age.
A king who could claw his way back from exile in 3 months was a force of nature.
This brings us back to the central fallacy, the idea that Philip created Macedonia from nothing.
Philip did not build on sand. He built on 3 centuries of survival, on a kingdom that had weathered every storm the gods could throw at it.
The kingdom had experienced many ups and downs, yes, but it had always survived, possessing a core.
The text reminds us, given stable internal affairs, this land represented a sleeping giant, waiting only for a unified mind to wake it.
And given favorable external circumstances, distracted neighbors and weakened rivals, Macedonia was capable of rapid expansion.
It was a power that was recognized and at times even courted by others, a pivot point upon which the fate of the Balkans turned.
This is what Philip inherited in 359. Not a vacuum, but a volatile Yet, the danger was real. The Illyrians were back, the Paeonians were raiding, and the pretenders to the throne were gathering. Before he could be Alexander's father in legacy, he had to be Macedonia's savior, in fact, removing the danger posed by the barbarians. The enormous expansion and consolidation of the Macedonian kingdom was his life's work, stitching the highlands to the lowlands.
Leader of the army ready to strike, transforming the seasonal levies into the most feared professional killing machine of the ancient world.
And perhaps most importantly, he cultivated a capable and loyal officer corps, turning unruly barons into the companions of the king.
No Alexander, if not for Philip, is true in more than just biological terms. It is the...
While the biology gave Alexander life, it was Philip's achievements that gave him the platform to conquer the world.
Alexander's triumphant conquests would not have been possible without the removal of threats that had plagued Macedonia for centuries.
Philip took the impossible geography of the Balkans, the mountains, the rivers, the marshes, and turned them into a fortress.
He broke the cycle of ups and downs that had defined the reigns of Perdiccas and Amyntas, replacing it with a linear trajectory of ascent.
The mines of the east, the timber of the mountains, the horses of the plains, he organized these resources into an engine of war.
He continued Archelaus' cultural efforts, making Pella a center that rivaled Athens, attracting the minds that would tutor his son.
He unified the spirit of the Macedonians, giving them a national identity that transcended their tribal loyalties.
Philip!
By the time of his death, the stage was not just set. The script was written, the act.
When Philip fell to an assassin's blade in 336, he did not leave a crumbling ruin like the kings before him.
He left a machine that continued to run. The army did not disband. The nobles did not rebel. The army was ready to strike. The officer corps was capable and loyal. The instrument was perfected.
Alexander turned his eyes to Asia, a dream that Philip had dreamed first, a campaign that Philip had already planned.
Philip was the bridge over which the history of the world crossed, from the classical to the Hellenistic age.
But let us not forget the roots of the bridge. The herdsmen of the Haliakmon, the timber cutters of Pieria.
It was their instinct for survival, honed over 3 centuries of ups and downs, that fueled the conquest.
Alexander owed his empire to Philip, but Philip owed his kingdom to the stubborn resilience of Amyntas.
Thus, the ancient authors are right in the details but wrong in the scope. Macedonia was not created from nothing. It was an ancient world reborn, a phoenix that had risen from its own ashes time and time again.
The march that began on the banks of the Haliakmon in the 7th century did not end until it reached India.
And in every step of that long march, the ghost of Philip walked alongside the sun, the silent architect of the glory.
The gulf, the rivers, the mountains, the geography that once divided them, became the armor that protected them.
The Illyrians, the Thracians, the Athenians, they were the whetstone against which the Macedonians,
Alexander I, Perdiccas II, Archelaus, Amyntas, the imperfect ancestors who held the line so that the perfect conqueror could be born.
History remembers the lightning, but the storm was centuries in the making.
The legacy of Philip is the map of the world reshaped. The legacy of Macedonia is the proof.
If the world fractures, I shall reshape it. Philip's unspoken motto became Alexander's reality.
In the fractured geopolitical landscape of the 4th century BC, the Kingdom of Macedonia was often dismissed as a
King Amyntas III, a survivor of chaos, understood that legitimacy came through utility.
The agreement was not merely commercial. It was a lifeline for Athenian naval ambitions, as recorded by Xenophon.
By 371, Amyntas was no longer a fringe ruler, but a recognized player. Amyntas had spent 10 grueling years pulling his nation back from the brink of disaster.
We must secure the northern border before the storm hits.
Though history would later be overshadowed by his son Philip, Amyntas left a stable foundation, proving that Macedonia.
In the winter of 370-69, the old king died, leaving behind a kingdom. The transition of power initially went smoothly, a testament to the order Amyntas had established. But the
Illyrians, fierce tribes from the northwest, saw the death of the old wolf as an invitation to hunt.
While the young king marched to face the Illyrians, a new threat emerged from the east. Pausanias.
Caught between a barbarian invasion and a usurper, the royal house of Macedonia at the edge of...
Eurydice turned to Iphicrates, a renowned Athenian general operating nearby to recover Amphipolis. The meeting was one of high drama. The queen presented her 2 younger sons, Perdiccas.
Iphicrates, seeing the strategic value in indebted Macedonia, mobilized his forces and drove the pretender Pausanias out of the country.
With the usurper gone and the Illyrians momentarily checked, Alexander II's rule was secured.
The Aleuadae, the noble family of Larissa, called upon Alexander to save them from the tyrant Alexander of Seizing the initiative, the Macedonian king marched his army into Thessaly, ostensibly as a liberator, but
Alexander entered Larissa and took the castle after a short siege, followed quickly by the fall of Cranon, demonstrating.
Instead of handing the towns back to the nobility, Alexander installed his own garrisons, a move that shocked the Thessalians and reversed.
Betrayed by their savior, the Thessalian nobles turned a dominant power of the age.
Pelopidas moved with the speed and force that had crushed Sparta at Leuctra, marching an army into Thessaly to liberate the cities from Macedonian rule.
Faced with the might of Thebes, Alexander then retreated, losing the second. The king's troubles were not over. Upon his return to Macedonia, he found that his brother-in-law, Ptolemaeus.
In a humiliating turn of events, both the king and the rebel Ptolemaeus appealed to Pelopidas, the very...
To ensure the loyalty of the Macedonian court, Pelopidas demanded hostages, including 30 sons of leading families. The peace brokered by Pelopidas was fragile. As soon as...
The friends of the murdered king refused to accept the usurper and once again called upon Pelopidas, who returned to Macedonia. Faced with the Theban army, Ptolemaeus was forced to negotiate, agreeing to preserve the throne for Amyntas' sons and entering a formal alliance with Thebes. To guarantee his compliance, Ptolemaeus was forced to surrender his own son and 5th noble hostages, draining the Macedonian aristocracy of its youth.
Once more, Macedonia lay at the mercy of external forces, a victim of its own.
But in 365, the cycle was broken by Perdiccas III, who, having reached adulthood, succeeded in ridding him.
Seeking to counterbalance Thebes, Perdiccas aligned himself with Athens, joining forces with their commander Timotheus, who was campaigning along the coast.
The joint Macedonian-Athenian force targeted the Chalcidians and the strategic city of Amphipolis, hoping to break the power of local rivals.
Timotheus captured Potidea and Torona, securing vital footholds, but Amphipolis remained elusive, a prize that neither ally could quite grasp.
The Athenians sent a clerici, a colony of citizen settlers, to Potidea to secure the strategic position, a move that alarmed the Macedonian king.
Working closely with Timotheus opened Perdiccas' eyes to Athens' renewal imperial ambitions, but also to the limits of their power.
Confident in his own strength, Perdiccas defected from the Athenian alliance, seizing Amphipolis for himself and installing a Macedonian garrison.
Perdiccas now faced war on multiple fronts. The Athenians, the Chalcidians, and internal rivals. Yet Macedonia...
He moved to reassert control over the upper Macedonian kingdoms, unifying the highland tribes that had often drifted away from the central monarchy.
But the old enemy remained. Perdiccas resolved to end the Illyrian threat once for all. We will...
It was a gamble that failed. In a great battle in 359, Perdiccas was defeated and killed along with 4,000 of his men.
Macedonia was on the precipice of extinction. The king was dead, the army destroyed, and enemies were...
In this darkest hour, Perdiccas' brother, Philip, stepped forward.
History has often painted Philip as a usurper who inherited chaos, a narrative pushed by later writers. But Philip's first move was ruthless internal housekeeping. He quickly eliminated the pretenders to the throne who surfaced, as they always did, in times of crisis. Athens, too, was entangled in the social war, witnessing the collapse of its second confederacy, leaving them unable to project power effectively against Philip.
Even Thebes, the former master of Macedonia, saw its power crumbling. Their attempt to extasize...
While Greece consumed itself in the south, the great kingdom of Thrace to the east, which had been reunited by King Cotys, suddenly shattered.
Following Cotys's murder in the summer of 360, the Thracian kingdom was torn apart by civil war, splitting into 3 rival factions.
Philip watched these events not with fear, but with the calculating eye of a predator, recognizing that his enemy's weakness was his greatest strength.
Before he could expand, Philip had to rebuild the army that had been annihilated with his brother, introducing the revolutionary Macedonian Phalanx.
His army forged, Philip turned his gaze west toward the Illyrians, the very people who had killed his brother and occupied Macedonian soil.
Bardilis, the aging Illyrian king, expected another easy victory, underestimating the transformation that had taken place in Pella.
In the early summer of 358, the two armies met near Lake Ochrid. It was here that
the Macedonian phalanx crashed into the Illyrian line, the sarissas outreaching the shorter Illyrian weapons, turning the battle into a slaughter. While the infantry pinned the enemy, Philip led his companion cavalry into the gap, shattering the Illyrian formation.
The victory was absolute. The Illyrians were forced to cede all territory up to Lake Ochrid.
With the west secured, Philip turned his attention to the north, where the Paeonians settled along the Axius River.
Luck continued to favor Philip. The Paeonian king died suddenly, leaving the tribe in confusion just as the Macedonian army approached.
Philip, ever the pragmatist, initially used gold rather than iron, bribing Paeonian leaders to maintain the peace while he dealt with other threats.
Payments bought Philip time, but he knew that a peace bought with gold would only last until the gold ran out.
Meanwhile, Athens began to realize that their former ally was becoming a dangerous rival, especially as Philip...
Abandoning all pretense, Philip besieged Amphipolis in 357, the city Athens had coveted for decades.
The city fell, and with it, Philip gained control of the gold mines of Mount Pangaeon, securing the immense wealth needed to fund his ambitions.
Alarmed by Philipp's meteoric rise, a grand coalition formed in 355.
Philip was surrounded. Enemies pressed from the west, north, and east, supported by the naval power of Athens from the south.
The summer of 356 was momentous. As the coalition gathered, Philip received news that his wife Olympia...
Refusing to be intimidated, Philip divided his command, sending his most trusted general, Parmenion, to deal with the Illyrians and Paeonians.
Parmenion proved equal to the task, moving with speed and aggression to intercept the coalition forces before they could unite.
The coalition, loosely bound by convenience, crumbled under the pressure. The Illyrians and Paeonians were defeated in detail.
This time, there were no bribes. The Paeonians were attacked, defeated, and brought firmly into line, their independence extinguished. To the east, Philip exploited the fractures in Thrace, pushing his border to the Nestus River and founding the city of Philippi to guard the gold mines.
Athens, paralyzed by the social war and financial crisis, could send no effective help to its northern allies.
With the defeat of the coalition, the western and northern borders remained quiet for more than 10 years, secured by Philip's iron grip.
Philip sought to permanently secure his western flank not just by war, but by dynastic politics, turning his eyes to the kingdom of Epirus.
In the late 350s, Philip intervened in Epirus, installing his brother-in-law Alexander on the throne.
As a reward for his protection, Philip annexed the region of Parawaea, a strategic highland area between Epirus and Macedonia.
These maneuvers created a buffer zone, insulating the Macedonian heartland from the Adriatic coast and allowing...
The Paeonians, once troublesome neighbors, were now integrated into the Macedonian military machine. Their light cavalry...
Peace on the borders meant prosperity at home. The gold from Pangaean and the timber trade fueled an economic boom that transformed Macedonia.
Philip's successes created a bond of loyalty with his people that bordered on worship. He was the savior who had delivered them from chaos. But even as he secured the north, Philip knew the real prize lay south, in the fractured, wealthy, and culturally prestigious world of Greece. Philip began to attract poets, historians, and philosophers to Pella, wishing to rival Athens not just in war, but in culture.
It was in this secure and rising kingdom that the young Prince Alexander was raised.
The Illyrian king, now old and defeated, could only watch from his mountains as the power he wanted.
For the first time in memory, the north was silent. The raids had stopped. The borders were sealed.
The army was now a veteran force, drilled to perfection, loyal only to their king, and ready for the greater challenges that lay ahead.
Philip's network of spies and diplomats extended into every Greek city, bribing politicians and sowing discord to prepare the way for his armies. The sacred war over Delphi provided the perfect pretext. Philip posed not as a conqueror, but as the pious
The Chalcidian League and its capital Olympus, once allies against Athens, now realized they were the next course in the Macedonian feast.
Under Philip, the Macedonian monarchy evolved from a weak institution dependent on tribal nobles into an...
The expansion came at a cost. Philip's body was a map of his war, and
The stage was set for the final confrontation. The north was secure. The army was...
The 350s BC were the decade that changed the world, transforming Macedonia from a victim into a predator, all through the will of one man.
As the decade closed, Philip II stood as the master of the Balkans. But for him, this was not the end. It was... The coalition formed in 356 between Illyria, Paeonia, and Thrace against Philip appeared formidable.
Athens was the fourth pillar of this alliance, yet as the text records, their involvement was merely nominal, paralyzed by their own crumbling empire.
From 357 to 355, Athens was consumed by the social war, fighting own rebellious...
Philip did not wait for his enemies to unite. He dispatched his most capable general, Parmenion, to dismantle the northern threat with surgical precision.
The result was a total collapse of the alliance. As the sources note, it was sufficient for Philip to send his general to pacify the region.
With the immediate threat crushed, Philip moved to ensure long-term stability by installing his brother-in-law, Alexander, on the throne of Epirus.
To further insulate his realm, Philip annexed Parawaea, the highland region between Epirus and Macedonia, locking the western gates of his kingdom. These measures were so effective that, as the historical record shows, the western region remained quiet for more than 10 years.
The Paeonians, who had once hoped to gain territory at the expense of a weakened Perdiccas III, were now fully subjugated.
Philip did not destroy the Paeonians, but integrated them. Their renowned light cavalry was added to the Macedonian army.
While Philip built his state, the southern powers continued to rot. Thebes, once the arbiter of Macedonian kings, saw its influence crumbling.
The Theban attempt to chastise the insubordinate Phocians backfired spectacularly, exposing the hollowness of Theban power. In the early summer of 356, the Phocians took the unthinkable step of occupying the sanctuary of Delphi. Using the immense treasures of the temple, the Phocians hired a massive army of mercenaries, turning the holy war into a commercial enterprise. This influx of gold allowed the Phocians to hold their own against the Amphictyonic League, plunging central Greece into a chaotic war of attrition.
Philip watched the sacred war from the north with patience, knowing that the chaos in the south was exhausting his potential rivals. The situation in Thrace was equally advantageous. King Perdiccas, who had briefly reunited the kingdom, was murdered, leaving a power vacuum. The breakup of Thrace into 3 parts in the subsequent battle for succession removed the threat of a unified eastern neighbor. Thus, the 350s saw convincing successes on all borders, a stark contrast to the brink of disaster. Yet, history must remember that Philip stood on the shoulders of his father, Amyntas III, whose stamina had first pulled the kingdom from the abyss. Amyntas had slowly overcome the disorder following Archelaus's murder, leaving a kingdom that was, if not powerful, at least secured.
Philip II is unwittingly responsible for the negative picture painted of his predecessors, as his brilliance totally eclipsed their struggles.
Contemporary writers like Theopompus and later historians like Diodorus portrayed Philip as a God-sent savior.
The history of Amyntas and Alexander II shows how quickly achievement could be jeopardized by a single lost battle or a succession crisis.
The text highlights a recurring pattern. External interference was always invited by internal turmoil and struggle for the throne.
Philip's greatest achievement was perhaps not military, but political, the ruthless elimination of pretenders which finally ended the cycle of civil war.
By securing the approaches to the kingdom, Philip ensured that war was fought on enemy soil, not in the Macedonian heartland.
With the borders safe, the agreement regarding ship timber, initiated by Amyntas and expanded by Philip, fueled the treasury.
Philip's rise was aided by the geopolitical vacuum. Sparta, defeated at Leuctra in 371, the Athenians, once the masters of the sea, watched their second confederacy fall apart, their naval power insufficient to check Philip.
Philip possessed a diplomatic skill that matched his military ability, making the most of each opportunity as it presented itself.
While previous kings fought pretender years for years, Philip eliminated them almost instantly. A testament.
The defeat of Bardilis in 358 was the turning point. It avenged Perdiccas and proved that the Macedonian
forcing the Illyrians to cede territories up to Lake Ohrid gave Macedonia a defensible natural frontier for the first time in history. The subjugation of the Paeonians created a buffer to the north, protecting Pella from the sudden raids that had plagued Amyntas's reign.
The installation of Alexander in Epirus turned a potential enemy into a family asset, securing the western flank through blood and marriage.
By the end of the 350s, Athens was isolated, her allies gone, her treasury empty, and her strategic northern outposts lost. Central to this success was the military reform. The sarissa-wielding Phalanx allowed Philip to punch above his weight against superior numbers.
But weapons alone do not build empires. It was Philip's personality, his willingness to fight and...
Despite the historical bias, Philip was the culmination of the Argead dynasty's efforts, finishing the work his father Amyntas had begun.
The greatest achievement of the decade was the neutralization of the northern threat.
With the barbarian periphery secured, Philip was now free to turn his undivided attention to the fragmented and warring city-states of the south. Provided the silver spears that would open the gates of Greek cities. Fight with silver spears, and you will conquer all. Macedonia had transformed from a victim of geopolitics into the new superpower of the Aegean, a shift that happened with blinding speed.
The Greek states had squandered the opportunity to stop Philip when he was weak, too busy fighting each other to notice the wolf at the door.
And in the nursery of Pella, the young Prince Alexander was growing up in a world where Macedonian victory was the natural order of things. The stability Philip achieved was the bedrock upon which Alexander would later build his world empire. Without Philip, there is no Alexander. The era of internal turmoil, of short-lived kings and foreign invasions was over. The era of Macedonian hegemony had begun. As we look back at the 350s, we see the pivot point of ancient history, where the classical Greek world began to give way to the Hellenistic age.
Philip II had secured his kingdom. Now he looked south, ready to reshape the fractured world of Greece in his own image.